Back in 2019, 3 years into our journey of raising trilingual children, my husband and I hit a wall. We were exhausted, frustrated, and on the verge of giving up our dream. Why? Because despite all our efforts, our son just wouldn't speak Chinese or Russian despite understanding them. He would only reply in English. We couldn't figure out what we were doing wrong. And then I learned something that changed everything for us. A simple equation. Within 3 months of applying it, our son was able to speak all 3 of his languages. Watching this 10-minute video can help you avoid years of unnecessary struggle and frustration that we experienced. In this video, I'm going to reveal this equation, explain why it's so crucial, and show you exactly how to make it work for your family. Let's dive in. Alright, let's jump straight to the crux of the issue, the equation. It's simple, but don't underestimate its power. Ready? Here it is. Bilingual success equals exposure plus need. That's it. So what does that mean? And let's break it down. Exposure is how much your child hears the language. Exposure correlates with the input, what goes in. Now let's look at the second half of the equation. Need. Need is how much they feel they must use the language. So this correlates with the output, what comes out. So together, these two create the perfect balance for language success. If either one is missing, the whole equation falls apart. I first came across this equation in Adam Beck's book, Maximize Your Child's Bilingual Ability, and it was like a total light bulb moment for us. This is it. This simple and elegant equation is the foundation for all language acquisition. We were struggling at the time because we were only addressing mostly the exposure part of the equation while neglecting the need component. Once I understood the equation, everything started falling into place, and bam, after 3 months of putting this equation into practice, my son started speaking our languages. Everything else flows from this. It's very much like dieting and weight loss. While there are hundreds of diets you can follow, keto diet, paleo diet, etc., and there are just as many exercise routines you can try, the mechanics of weight loss boil down to the simple equation of weight loss equals calories in minus calories out. This equation is literally based on the scientific principle of thermodynamics. Yes, many factors can influence how high your metabolism is and how many calories you burn, and 100 calories from a piece of celery aren't the same nutritionally as 100 calories from a Kit Kat bar. Yeah, but the fundamental mechanics of weight loss remains the same. Calories in, calories out. Everything else flows from this. By the way, if you're finding this video helpful so far, it would be awesome if you could hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. You may also want to check out my book, Bilingual and Trilingual Parenting 101, which has sold thousands of copies on Amazon, helping multilingual families around the world. Thank you. Let's jump back right in. Now, let's talk about why this equation is so crucial. What happens if the balance is off? If there's plenty of exposure but no need to speak the language, your child may understand the language but never speak it or rarely speak it. That's called passive bilingualism. That's essentially, what happened with us. Our son was getting plenty of exposure, but because we didn't really create or enforce the need to speak the languages, he would just speak to us in English. So let me give you an example. When my son was younger, he could understand Chinese perfectly. If I asked him to bring me a 杯子, a cup or a mug, a glass, he would bring me a cup. But here's the thing, he wouldn't respond in Chinese. If I asked him, 杯子在哪里? Where is the cup in Chinese? He would say in English, it's in the kitchen. Why? Because he didn't need to respond in Chinese. He knew he could just answer in English and that I would understand him and respond to him anyway. Here I want to emphasize that there's nothing inherently wrong with passive bilingualism, not at all, okay? In fact, it is still something that needs to be celebrated because even achieving that isn't easy. But if for whatever reason you do want your child to actively speak the target language, then you might want to see which part of the equation is falling short in your situation. Now, on the other hand, I have a friend whose family faced a different challenge. Both parents wanted their children to learn Cantonese, but at home they mostly spoke English because my friends, both the mom and dad, they're second generation Chinese. So, in their situation, exposure was kind of low, and the need was even lower. The kids didn't really interact with Cantonese speakers except when they visited their grandparents. And when the kids were left with their Cantonese speaking grandparents, they couldn't communicate at all. It's not an ideal situation for the kids or the parents or the grandparents. And it all came down to the equation, right? Both exposure and need were missing in their everyday life. So when there's a genuine need to speak the language, the foundation just isn't there because there wasn't that input to build that foundation on. Alright, so now you know the equation and why it matters, but how can you actually apply it? Let's break it down into practical steps. First, let's tackle exposure. I would argue that this is the easier part because it's all about creating opportunities for your child to hear the language. So if you speak to them in that language, that is exposure, right? If you want to raise your child to be bilingual or trilingual, this usually means speaking to them in the target language most of the time. If you want to start slowly, you can begin introducing the target language as part of your daily routine, like reading books or bedtime stories in the target language, speaking the target language at meal times, taking actual language lessons, and so forth. Obviously, the more exposure your child gets in terms of frequency and quantity and quality as well, the faster they are likely to make progress. Okay, so that's the exposure part of the equation. This is arguably the easier part. I think it's relatively easy for a child to pick up enough of a language by hearing it spoken a lot. In my experience, 70 to 80% of families who have a bilingual or multilingual household fall into this category. The children typically understand some or even quite a lot of the target language being spoken by the parents or grandparents because they are exposed to it a lot. Maybe the parents speak to each other in that language, or maybe one or both of the parents speak to the child in that language sometimes or most of the time. So exposure seems to be the easy part. I think harder to crack is the second part of the equation, need. I've made an entire video explaining what we did to overcome this particular problem, linked down below. But essentially, in very simple terms, we set and enforced the expectation that our son had to speak and reply to us in Russian or Chinese. If he replied to us in English, we gently but firmly asked him to say the sentence again in Russian or Chinese. If he didn't know how to say it, we said it for him and encouraged him to repeat after us. Look, I'm absolutely not advocating this method as the only method that will work. In fact, I'm very aware that what we did was pretty, maybe not extreme, but certainly quite involved. But in our case, there was no easy way to enforce the need to speak the language. Our son knew we speak English. He knew his grandparents speak English. He never spent time in Russia or China where he would have to speak the local language to get by. So we saw it as our job to create those conditions for him. This is the route we personally took, but I have seen how other families have intentionally, or in many cases, unintentionally found other ways to address the need component of the equation. Let me tell you about a friend of mine who is from China originally and is married to an English guy. They have a little girl who is now 5. When she was 3 or 4, I saw that she understood Chinese when mom spoke to her, but she always replied in English. My friend was well aware of this and said, what can you do? It's really tough. My husband doesn't speak Chinese. Half a year later, we met up again, and I was astonished that the girl was now speaking Chinese. What changed? Turned out that the girl spent a whole summer in China with the grandparents, mostly without her own parents there. The grandparents don't speak a word of English. They live in a small town or maybe even a village where no one speaks any English. So suddenly there was like a massive need for this girl to speak Chinese. Luckily, she already had a good foundation because of the previous exposure input that she'd had, all the input she had built up, so it didn't take her long to start speaking Mandarin. This trip to China proved to be a pivotal moment in her language journey because she now routinely speaks to her mum in Chinese. Would this have happened had she not spent a summer in China where she was forced to speak Chinese at that age? I guess we'll never know, but what we can say for sure is that the genuine need to speak Chinese that summer absolutely supercharged her language progress. So there you have it. Bilingual success equals exposure plus need. It's simple but incredibly powerful. Understand it, apply it, and I guarantee you'll see results probably much faster than you expect. So I encourage you to take a moment to take stock. Where does your family stand with exposure and need right now? What's one small change you can make today to get you closer to your goals? If you want to hear the full story of how we helped our son become actively trilingual in 3 months, check out this video. And if you found this helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your own language stories in the comments. I would love to hear them.